Welcome to the Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast. I want to thank you all for listening to us. We've got some great listeners here lately. People have been writing us a little bit here and there over the summer, so I'm really glad you people are still out there.
We love the feedback.
It's been great. This month, we're going to be diving into some pretty cool stuff. One of my favorite things to do, at least in the history world, is to go to the library. And I know that may sound boring to people, but honestly, I've been doing that since I was like 10. So it just gets better as I get older.
You too, Greg, huh?
Yeah, good, yeah. It's one of those moments when we didn't have internet, so if you needed to know anything that was more than what your parents knew.
Something fun to do, yeah, you go to the library.
Pick a topic, find the books. It was cool. Anyway, yeah, we were nerds. We've got a cool library story this month that I think is going to be kind of slick. And Michael was actually the guy who was digging through the library this time. Michael, where were you? Why were you there? And what did you find?
Absolutely. So I was up at Brinsmead University, and if our listeners aren't familiar with that, that's our Adventist University in Canada, in Alberta. So I was excited to be there. We had all of our pastors for union-wide, Canadian Union Church in Canada, so pastors meeting. So a lot of pastors from all across Canada. So I was giving a series of talks, training pastors, etc. And so many of our pastors from Canada, shout out to Canada here. And so I'm there, but, since I'm at an Adventist college campus, what's the thing to do?
Go to the library.
Absolutely. So that's what I did. I asked for permission if I could go down to the archives, to the Heritage Room. They actually have a couple of different things. They have like an actual separate archives, which is actually in a different location across near the ABC for any of our listeners that are up in Alberta.
Nice.
But they actually also have like a heritage collection, which has like just old Adventist history kinds of stuff, random kinds of more like books and things.
So, yeah. And a lot of our colleges have that.
Yeah, right? It's true. And so it's not like the minutes and the it's just a bunch of old books, and that's in some compact shelving. So I was excited because then I could dive in and see what exactly do they have. There's some things I haven't seen before, and I was kind of excited on a personal level because I'm working on our North American Division block of Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventism articles, so I was waiting to see. I was kind of really looking to see, are there some maybe papers or theses or anything that's on how Adventism developed in Canada, and there were. I actually found a fair bit of material that was going to be very helpful for some of those articles. But I was also kind of curious because you just sometimes stumble on some other things, and what I stumbled on was a fairly interesting collection of Brinsmead material.
Ooh, yeah.
Now, some of our listeners may not be as familiar with Brinsmead, but if you have listened maybe to the Adventist History Podcast with our good buddy Matthew Lucio, you know that actually Brinsmead was an Adventist. Robert Brinsmead was an Adventist in Australia who began to become very kind of influential there, especially in the 1960s. Okay. And so he's beginning to he's kind of on I guess the best way to put it from my viewpoint is kind of like on a perfectionistic kind of streak, right? And so as he goes increasingly more and more, he's focusing on the investigative judgment, 1844, cleansing of the sanctuary, and he develops kind of this theology of like most of Adventism's in the holy place. You want to get to the most holy place. So Adventists are the church is kind of on the cusp of the outside of the second apartment of the sanctuary. And this is a little bit problematic because he kind of starts developing a theology that is kind of critical towards church leadership that will get him in trouble.
Right.
And I mean, you start saying Adventist church leaders are in apostasy. Usually that's not very good for church employment.
No.
Or anybody with you, that's just not, that's for obvious reasons, that's not kosher. And so he's finding himself increasingly estranged from the denomination, and today we might even call it, they weren't using this terminology, but in my viewpoint, it kind of is moving towards what maybe some people might call last generation theology. It's that intense focus on being perfect and
well, and because Brinsmead said the sanctuary that is talked about in prophecy is not the heavenly sanctuary, it is the individual.
Absolutely.
And as the individual
has to prepare.
And if Jesus is moving into the most holy place represented by us individually, well, Jesus is going to make us perfect.
And I will be the first to also tell you there's a lot of different flavors of Christian religion theology.
There really is.
But he has his own unique flavor, but he is really critical of the denomination. So I was kind of intrigued, even I might say excited, because I like to say that
he sent us pictures right from the library. Let's just say it that way.
I specialize in Adventist heresy. Or I don't know if Adventist heresy finds me or what it is.
It's an active field. There's
plenty
a
lot
draw
there. Yeah. Actually, the funny thing was that one of the talks I gave while I was there was a history of Adventist heresy.
See, you were already primed for this discovery. It was right there.
So we were having, and so and basically for those that might be curious, I'm looking at the early Christian church and the different heresies and patterns and similarities that we see in some of the heterodox movements in Adventist history. So just so you know, I'm not going around with any kind of heresy barometer.
Heresy stick?
Heresy stick.
Actually, there's a dowsing rod. I've seen people going.
Oh, let's not go down this path, Greg. but yeah, so Brinsmead, he's kind of a thorn in the flesh for church leaders in the 1960s on into the 70s. Intriguingly, toward later on in life, he'll kind of do this kind of flip-flop thing. We'll see this happen quite a bit in theology, where extreme theology breeds extreme reactions. Mm-hmm. So there will be but for what he's most well known for is when he's in this perfectionistic phase. So I was pretty excited. Greg, I found a couple of different things. We can talk about different ones in whatever order, but finding some Brinsmead material, found some material that was somebody from on the inside who kind of gets ousted for a while.
Yeah, it was kind of like a testimony of coming out of the Brinsmead movement. Yeah. That was great.
And then we also find some other materials from some young church leaders, like thought leaders that become famous later, like Bakioki.
Yep.
He's responding to it, and even a religion teacher that's at Union College. And he will be sort of accused of being sympathizing with Brinsmead because his son is involved in his ministry. So there's a lot of personal ramifications there, but maybe we can do this in whatever order, but some of the Brinsmead, let's start with Brinsmead and the material. Huh?
Sure, yeah. I mean, that one was a book. That was the big chunk that I was looking through. And I thought he did, honestly, it was funny. I didn't read it in the right order when you sent it. I read the responses to him, and then I read him. And it's funny when you read things like that, when you listen to the critics first, before listening to the person, you get a totally different impression. Yeah. Like, even as I'm just listening to them restating his arguments, when I read his arguments in his own words, I was like, oh, that's definitely a little bit different. He was much more engaging, honestly. I was expecting kind of a cantankerous perfectionist. But
he was a very engaging personality. Yeah. I mean, he is very winsome, and that's what it partly attracted people to his views. He's dynamic. I would even say charismatic, but not. I have to be careful. He wasn't going Pentecostal, but just,
right.
But he was a dynamo, right? So, and there was something about him that attracted people to himself too.
I really do want to hear him talk. I haven't listened to any audio stuff, but reading his book, it was much better than a dry theology book that I've read many other places.
And maybe some of our listeners will have some tapes and can kind of help point us to, if someone's listening and you've got some tapes of Brinsmead, let us know. We would love to hear that, because we're always looking to try to preserve Adventist history.
Yeah.
So anyways.
Yeah, so reading through his book, my impression was, he's taking a different tack. He starts with well-trod ground, and talking about the sanctuary. What was it? What happened in 1844? I mean, it's the tried and true in a lot of ways. And then his twist was that the heavenly sanctuary is the human soul,
right?
And it's specifically the Adventist soul, right? And that perfection of character that Jesus is bringing to the most holy place, where he finishes the work, that was seen to be the element of the end that was going to usher in the second coming. Yeah. So until Jesus finishes the work, which he used a lot of interesting Ellen White quotes for, and some weird...
He does quote Ellen White.
He quoted Ellen White a lot, which I always found to be fascinating, because usually you're going to at least have some element of, here's my Bible, and then I'm going to talk about what... But he really starts with just Ellen White.
Yeah.
And
by the way, it's interesting. In addition to the material we found up at Berman, at the same time I found on eBay, Adventist historians, we're looking everywhere, right? So eventually,
there's nothing on eBay. Don't. It's really it's the worst place we go.
Or if you buy it, just send it.
Or do that.
Okay. Anyways, I found this, and it was a manuscript. It's actually marked not for circulation, but obviously it's
circulating now.
It's circulated. It's been circulated, but it's his manuscript on Ellen White. And basically what he does is he takes all the major beliefs and he basically shows, he's using as a sort of like Ellen White as a proof text manual for constructing his theology.
Yeah.
So that was kind of interesting to me because it was giving me a window into Brinsmead a little bit more because he's clearly operating out of a context, a hermeneutic.
I was going to say, that is the Ellen White-centric hermeneutic that
if there ever was one.
If there ever was one.
Yeah,
and he's not the only one. I mean, I'd say he fits his time.
Mm-hmm. He does.
Really.
Yeah.
So, he's developing his theology of the soul is the perfection. The goal of perfection is the second coming. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, was kind of
interesting.
It was an interesting take on it. And then listening to the responses, that's the stuff I never heard.
Well, let's talk about that. What were some of the responses? We got
Bakioki had a big one. I honestly, and I wouldn't say that I'm always reading Bakioki and feeling like he's middle of the road on things, but I honestly felt like he was a little bit middle of the road here.
Okay.
He disagreed with Brinsmead.
Yeah.
And said, here's where I think he's wrong.
Yeah.
But honestly, I thought he did pretty well at trying to ferret out the positive and the negative.
Yeah.
He clearly said, I'm not going to stand with him because I think he's wrong.
Right.
But he was fairly even-handed.
Yeah.
But again,
so affirming some things and then saying, here's where I disagree.
Yeah. But again, when he said he disagreed, the support for his disagreement was, guess what?
I think I know where you're going, Greg.
It was Ellen White quotes all over the place,
So fighting Ellen White with Ellen White.
Bingo. Who can add, and it wasn't, and I was glad for this at least, it wasn't who had the most quotes.
Yeah.
That's usually how that rabbit trail goes for me anyway. No, he really fought the idea and said he quoted Ellen White wrong here, or he twisted what she meant here, he didn't look at the context of her.
Yeah.
But again, at the same time, I'm sitting here going, we're talking a divine commentary argument here. We're fighting with multiple layers of
hermeneutics. Yeah. Well, it sounds like the 1960s in Adventism and the 70s. Those were the battle lines were drawn.
Right.
So interesting. Well, I was surprised. I had no idea Bakioki had written anything as a response to Brinsmead at this, at one particular point when he would have actually been quite young at that particular time.
I want to say it was 65.
Something like that.
It was somewhere in the middle 60s. Yeah, it wasn't. I mean, he wrote it as a thesis paper for a class, it said.
Right, he's clearly a student.
Yeah, so he was a student at least. Mm-hmm. So what was the other one that was standing out to you?
Well, the other one is the story of some church workers in Australia that they're very enamored with Brinsmead to the point where they start increasingly become critical. They lose their church employment, and so and this is actually, they tell their own story. So it's
the husband and wife
autobiographical, So that's the end of their ministry for a while, and they actually will be very loyal, adherents of Brinsmead, and so they'll have Brinsmead frequently. He'll be a guest in their home and speaking with their small group that they've organized, because obviously they're no longer officially employed by the church, but they draw other people with them when they leave. And at one point, not only have they lost church employment, but they're actually going to have their church membership dropped completely.
Yeah, right.
And it's at that point.
2 years later, though.
Yeah, 2 years later.
They're dropped from ministry, and then 2 years later, they're looking at disfellowship, which I was proud of, at least.
Yeah. I mean, if you really believe the church is Babylon, then you probably shouldn't be Adventist.
Right.
I mean, that's there's kind of at some point there's some kind of threshold you've gone way beyond.
Yeah.
And anyways, I don't think people should be harsh in retribution, trying to get rid of people.
And that's what kind of what I was happy to see. They didn't just fire them and disfellowship them.
It did take some time.
There was a gap.
But when they get to the church membership part, they realize, wait a minute, where have we gone?
Yeah.
And it's sort of like this come to Jesus moment, kind of a self-awareness, self-awakening, and they realize, wait a minute, we've made a mistake. And so they're telling their story, how they kind of got into Brinsmead, and then they're leaving that movement, that group, and returning to church. They realize they've become bitter, and they actually write apology letters to church leaders saying, we basically repent, of calling the church Babylon, that we see how this has made us critical, not only to the church, but how we relate to others, and it's really impacted that social aspect.
It's a rarity. I don't hear that particular story come back too often.
No, usually it's kind of, they just keep on going.
We're out and we
train.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and more extreme. But that was refreshing.
It was. It was a good read.
Yeah, and again, you just never know. You're going to find it in an archive, and at some point, they wrote down their story, and someone kept a copy of that story, and it ended up in the archives, and so there it was, and for us to be able to read and be able to review. So
and I got a sense that they were really effective in the ministry and the publishing side of things.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
They were like one of the people that
part
really
of the publishing arm.
Yeah.
And by the way, that is also what made Brinsmead so successful is that mass appeal, mass distribution. Of course, there's no internet at this point, but they're able to get their ideas out to a lot of people.
Yeah, tapes, pamphlets, books. I mean, it was
a media.
It was
empire.
a bonanza, and really, when you're looking at these things, even today, one person can do that on the internet, sure, but when you get enough group of people, that's when things become a movement.
And I think that's where Brinsmeadism, as it comes to be known. And by the way, if you want to, there's a great article in the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventism that Kyle DeWall has written. So just check it out if you want a little bit more in detail on the whole Brinsmead kind of thing and that as a movement. But yeah, church leaders had good reason to be worried.
Yeah. And ultimately, I mean, they were a rarity in the movement. I don't think there was that many like them.
Yeah.
But the ending of their little paper I thought was interesting. It was an appeal to Brinsmead himself.
Exactly.
Right? Ending it out by saying, we were wrong. We think you're wrong.
Yeah.
Don't go down the trail that you seem to be going down. Like, calling back from that.
Right.
Which was interesting. And knowing how Brinsmead's story kind of ends, obviously that kind of all plays into it. Like, you as the audience may not know, so we'll keep that until the end. But what was one of the other ones that kind of stood out?
Let's see. I'm trying to. Oh yes, there was one other one where there was a religion professor at Union College, your alma mater.
Good old Union.
Yeah, and his son had gone and basically joined Brinsmead in his movement. So there he is in the United States. His son is enamored and goes out and basically is working for Brinsmead. He's become one of his followers, if you please.
Yeah.
And so this makes his father suspect. You have a son, so then are you secretly some kind of Brinsmead person,
Heresy has a tendency to make everybody suspicious.
Yeah, so it truly is a guilt by association.
It is, yeah.
And so this triggers a whole series of investigations. Do I dare say heresy hearings?
Yeah,
that's
sort of.
That's what it is.
Yeah,
they're concerned that, hey, we have a secret heretic on our watch.
Staff.
Yeah.
Teaching kids.
And so this triggers a whole series of warnings, letters, interviews, board leaders, union president, who's the board chair, basically having ongoing conversations and basically, why won't you condemn Brinsmead? Just come out and make a strong statement and clearly condemn him. And here you have, and this is the challenge of theology sometimes. There's the intellectual, but there's also the personal. Yeah. And so he doesn't want to make a strong statement for obvious reasons. His son is part of that movement, and I can only imagine that would estrange things further.
Sure.
So here we have a father who's kind of caught betwixt and between, and kind of saying, well, this is what I believe, and so there's constant pressure to really explain until finally, eventually, he'll make a strong enough statement that they're willing to kind of back away from him. So So that was kind of interesting because you see basically an attempt at how do we regulate orthodoxy with a religion professor.
Right.
And again, this whole thing, guilt by association. Okay, we know this guy's a bad guy. Have you been tainted?
Yeah,
Have
exactly.
you been tainted? And it shows you, I think, some of the pressure, the milieu, that mindset of the 1960s that, you have to prove your orthodoxy, really.
Yeah,
right? And so it's definitely an era of being very conservative. I know some people, not many people have written about Adventism in the 60s and 70s. Probably one of the few that I can think of might be Gilbert Valentine, who wrote The Ostriches and Canaries. And
it's
whatever you think about that book, there seems to be a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's what, you definitely get that in a variety of different angles. And this is one at just one of our smaller schools at that time, and clearly, again, guilt by association. But my reading of the whole experience, and he lays it all out there eventually, giving the whole history and who contacted him when, and letters and everything. This is sort of his
get it off his chest.
culpa,
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and so that was very interesting. It gives, again, I think that context of the 1960s through the early 70s of what's going on in Adventism.
Yeah.
And someday, that's thanks to the fact that we have these documents that have been preserved. It's going to enable historians to be able to do more research. We've done a lot of work on early Adventism, and by comparison, with just a few exceptions, as I already noted, we've done very little in the 20th century, and the closer we get to the present, obviously it's more sensitive the closer we get to the present.
It's messier.
But if you think about it, 1973, right, to 2023, that's
50 years.
50 years.
Yeah.
It's been 50 years, so it's time to be able to really talk about the 1960s and 70s. That's more than enough time. Even archives, like the standard archival restrictions in the denomination, 25 or 30 years, depending on the material. But this is 50 years. This is well past that.
Right.
So it's time.
We've hit the spot, and frankly, as historians, we also want our research to help in the future, in the present, and
Sure.
whatever. We can't leave it all out.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we will have nothing left to talk to.
Well, and that's why
nobody
I'm glad we
left
found
to
that,
talk to, right?
these materials at Berman. That's why I'm
Yeah.
glad we found this Brinsmead manuscript on Ellen White on eBay. We're always looking, putting our tentacles out there, Craig, right? How do we find this material and preserve it so that then it's accessible for future as well as podcast episodes, which is
to help
fun.
us. Yeah, and for me, honestly, the exciting part is looking and saying, you know what, we struggle with stuff today. We have theological discussions and debates and whatever. We're not alone in that.
No, not at all.
And seeing the debates and how it went back then can inform and make me feel somewhat better in cases where it's hard to see my church struggle. But I can see we've always struggled. Right?
Yeah, and how do we disagree gracefully and respectfully? The true test of character isn't whether you agree with everybody around you, but really the true test of character is how do you disagree with people?
Right.
And in Adventist history, there's times we've done it well, and frankly, there's times we've not done it so well. And I think it's unfortunate, that there was a suspicion of guilt by association.
Yeah.
That it's just unfortunate, but
especially in an academic setting where you've got you have to have a certain level of academic integrity and also open thinking to consider. That's hard. Yeah. It's a hard spot to be.
But at the same time, I can also understand church leaders. How far is the contagion gone? There's
right.
people calling the denomination Babylon, and you can't have people working for you that are undermining you too.
Yeah.
So,
and that was actually an interesting part brought out by the people that left.
Yes.
One of the things they thought was so distasteful was how much the Brinsmead material was turning against the church that they still loved.
Yeah.
And then how Brinsmead himself was setting himself up as the end all.
Arbiter.
Exactly. Yeah. If you go against us, then you are also
And they also talk about when they finally come back that they were kind of really ostracized, and the same way that they were treating church, it's sort of flip-flopped again. And so there is this really critical issue of trust, right? That's part of it. And then how do we treat one another?
Yeah. And it was good to see both of those, right?
Yeah, I'm so thankful. Denominational leaders, they said, okay, there are some boundaries. but they loved them back into the church, really.
Yeah.
And they became lifelong church workers.
And they were not just gone.
The ones in Australia.
Right.
And it kind of, I'm still not sure I rest easy with what happened with the other religion professor at Union. That doesn't settle quite so well with me. If a family member goes rogue.
Are we really going to hang the parent for...
Yeah, what do you do with that?
I know.
But at the end of the day, it's a matter... we don't write the history that we want to write. We have to write the history that we actually find.
Right.
In the more recent history, we know there's a lot out there, and that's part of why we have to preserve and continue to find these kinds of materials. That's why we're saying, hey, if you got Brinsmead tapes and materials, let us know. You don't have to send us the originals. Just make a copy. We'd be really excited about that.
Yeah. Because the more we have of the story, the more there is to talk about.
The more there is.
I mean, I look up a Brinsmead article on the encyclopedia, and I can read the story of Brinsmead, but I don't see the whole that happened, everything around it. I don't know what other people felt like.
Yeah.
I hear about it from probably a conference level of objective opinion on the thing.
Yeah.
I don't hear these people who were just, little Bible workers and colporteurs that got sucked into the movement because they were excited about it. Yeah. You hear their story, and you start to realize this was something I can relate to.
Right.
It's not just dry theologians hacking at each other in an ivory tower somewhere.
Exactly. Well, I think we covered this pretty thoroughly.
Yeah. And, so let's not leave him hanging, though.
Okay.
Brinsmead himself.
That's right. Tell us the end.
I loved what I saw hinted at in Bakioki's paper.
Okay.
He said in a couple of different spots that Brinsmead himself, when confronted, what if you're wrong, Brinsmead? What if you are in error about this whole thing?
Yeah.
And he's like, if I find and truly can see that I'm in error, then I will go back to a nice little garden that I have in town, and I will spend the rest of my life there, knowing that I chose the wrong and did the wrong thing.
Right.
And to me, that's just really ironic, because that is exactly where he ended up, right?
Right. He kind of went back to that fruit farm. I think they called it Fruitopia or something like that.
Fruitopia, yeah. It's today, and it's still around.
Yeah.
It's like a big thing, actually. It's kind of its own
like
event
an amusement
park.
Almost
Yeah.
park. Yeah. So he really did what he said he was going to do.
Yeah.
So he ended up...
Honestly, it has an echo of Thanos in it, but I shouldn't draw that correlation. Sorry.
Well, thanks for listening to Adventist Pilgrimage. I want to put a personal plug out here because we have something really extra special. We have a special conference on women in Adventist history. So if you're interested in that, go to the North American Division, our Archive, Statistics, and Research webpage, or on our page or on Facebook and social media. We have it listed a lot of different places, but that's October 12 to 14. This will be our September episode. So if you have the opportunity, we've got some of the top women's historians inside the church, outside of the church, that will be coming. We're going to talk. This is not some conference about women's ordination or anything like that. That's not what this is about. This is about trying as historians, that we've not always done a good job telling the stories of the contributions of women in Adventist history. We want to rectify that a little bit, at least in our small way and we have Matthew Lucio, we've got, I think we've got Greg.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm
working on it. And we've got about 30 other historians that are going to be giving presentations, papers, and all kinds of different things.
It's going to be great.
So just a little personal plug out there. If you love Adventist history, and if you find a way that you can join us, we'd love to see you at that. And it'll be at Washington Adventist University in Sligo, October 12 to 14. Well, thanks for joining us for another episode of Adventist Pilgrimage Podcast. And until next month, keep on studying our past, and we hope it'll challenge and inspire you. Until next time.